Hi again, all.
Hi. We are continuing in with Ray Franz's In Search of Christian Freedom, and the subheading was, What of Today's Slave Class? So he continues. Passing beyond the situation of Charles Taze Russell's time and the period of 1919 and the early 1920s, what of the now existing circumstances of what the Watchtower depicts as the slave class? This, after all, is all that most of Jehovah's Witnesses today are familiar with, all they have ever known. The understanding of Jehovah's Witnesses has long been that all the individuals, the 8,800 anointed, making up the composite slave, share in the parabolic food dispensing. Also that as a collective body, they have all now been placing over the master's belongings, have been placed over the master's belongings to administer his earthly interests. How true is this picture of all these anointed members sharing in the feeding work, and today sharing in supervising all the master's belongings? We need first to ask how the organization itself presents this feeding work and its own statements as to what the spiritual food dispensed is.
There is not the slightest question that in the minds of Jehovah's Witnesses as a whole, the food at the due time provided by the slave is the information supplied by the Brooklyn-centered Watchtower organization contained in its publications and directives. That understanding has been consistently developed in them by article after article over a period of many years. Typical is the statement in the February 1, 1952 Watchtower, which, in discussing how witnesses should react toward what they read in Watchtower publications, says on pages 79 and 80, quote, "Let us not try to take over the slave's duties. We should eat and digest and assimilate what is set before us, without shying away from parts of the food because it may not suit the fancy of our mental taste. The truths we are to publish are the ones provided through this discreet slave organization, not some personal opinions contrary to what the slave has provided as timely food."
Over 30 years later, the January 1st, 1986 issue of the Watchtower makes this same application and clearly shows the official view that the food provided by the slave class is to be found in the publications of the Watchtower. After describing plans and projects for constructing large buildings and printing facilities in various countries, including a proposed 35-story high-rise building in Brooklyn, the article states on page 25, quote, "Is all this construction and organizing really necessary? It is, if the faithful and discreet slave is to continue providing spiritual food at the proper time. Such food is vitally necessary for the growth of the household of God and for the global preaching in the upwards of 200 languages." End of quote. The food, then, is obviously presented as meaning the printed information published by and through the Brooklyn-based Watchtower Society. This raises questions.
Since the slave is said to be made up of all the anointed Christians, many of Jehovah's Witnesses are puzzled as to how this food supplying by them works out in actual practice. I myself, from an early point on, could not understand just how it was that these anointed ones, at least if located outside of the Brooklyn headquarters, in any way shared in the development and supplying of the spiritual food presented. My father had been baptized in 1913 and professed to be of the anointed, as did my mother and others I knew. Yet the new ideas and teachings that were periodically published, replacing previous teachings, came as much as a surprise to them as to me and to others who did not profess to be of that number. To say, as some did, that the anointed in general shared in the parabolic food distribution simply by accepting these teachings as they came out and by talking about them to others seemed an artificial explanation, since those who were not of the anointed did exactly the same thing.
For those witnesses who had no concept of the way the organization's international headquarters functions, there no doubt exists some vague idea that okay, I'm going to have to say that one again. For those witnesses who have no concept of the way the organization's international headquarters functions, there no doubt exists some vague idea that the thinking, scriptural research, and conclusions of those 8,800 anointed ones somehow, in some manner, eventually find their way to the Brooklyn headquarters and gain the attention of the governing body, which is stated to be the spokesman for the faithful and discreet slave class, as also its administrative section. Since the organization's doctrine development process is very private, this allows for considerable conjecture on the part of those trying to grasp the mystery of the relationship between the 8,800 and the Brooklyn headquarters. Some have even thought that periodic surveys are taken to learn the views of the anointed earthwide. The mist clears the closer one comes to the center of the organization. The idea that a collective body of 8,800 anointed ones supplies spiritual food, and as a body shares in exercising direction over the interests and affairs of the Master's household, proves to be wholly theory, not in any sense reality. It is perhaps the most obvious fiction found in the whole range of published explanations of Scripture produced by the organization. The fact is that not even 1% of the number of the anointed ones have the slightest part in determining what Jehovah's Witnesses receive in the way of biblical material, or in forming of policy, or the directing of the activities of that people. Yeah, I didn't know about his parents. I guess I should have figured that. If his parents were witnesses, they would have thought of themselves as anointed. So his comment about them being just as surprised as anyone else at information when it changes, I thought was quite telling, and it also rung true to me in that in one of the congregations that I was at, there was someone who claimed to be of the anointed. A very sweet old lady, but you didn't get the sense that she had any spiritual enlightenment or superiority to anyone else. When she answered at the Kingdom Hall, she read straight from the Watchtower. When you went out in field service with her or talked with her, she didn't have extra knowledge or insights. You know, you just felt she was
by the book.
Yeah, she was by the book, and she was following what the Watchtower directed. She was loyal to the publications, not they were loyal to her thinking.
And I, too, was given a very vague notion when I asked any questions about this early on in my studies before I got baptized. It was along the lines he mentions here of somehow this 8,000, or at that point 10,000 that were alive, were supposed to be communicating constantly with the headquarters. Mm-hmm. That was the impression I was given.
Yeah.
But Ray, being an insider, knows the truth about that. Yeah. So it's very interesting that now they've dropped this, what he calls obvious fiction. Mm-hmm. They've dropped the pretense completely that the anointed are somehow running the organization. It's the governing body that are the faithful and discreet slave. And it always has been. In the governing body originally was Charles Russell. Then it was Rutherford by himself for a period. And then there was, as Ray points out here and in the previous segment, a kind of a going back to the Russell days in many aspects, including the appointment of elders. But it's always been the guys in Brooklyn that are feeding the flock.
Yeah, it's top down.
Next segment will be who actually supplies the food.